The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone. We've started the broadcast and we've started the recording. I'm very pleased that Tom Gilb has made it once again to complete the series of 5 workshops that he's delivered via this medium. And today's is slightly different from the preceding ones in that it's a fairly non-technical subject. We're going to be talking about the UN sustainability goals and how to improve on them. I'm going to, if all of you can see the chat window and the questions window, you can raise your hand and ask a question via the questions window anytime. And on the chat window, I'm about to send you the links to all of the materials being used tonight. These are also on the first slide that you can see in front of you. Okay, I think it's time to begin. So I'm going to mute myself and go out of the camera shot and hand over to Tom. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you, Imo and Margaret Ross, who are sponsoring us. So the first slide, first you might like to photograph it because it's got all the links, including links to exactly these slides, which are exactly here. That's about 130 megabytes, and then there's a much smaller PDF download here, about 30 megabytes if you prefer that. Just to either make you envious or to remind myself of what I'm not doing right now, yesterday I was here on the Oslo Fjord at my summer cabin. It's my beach. And that's the view of the Oslo Fjord. And I could have been there today. It's beautiful weather, but I'm here with you, and it shows my priorities. But it was really tough. Okay, beautiful. The water lapping and the birds flying across and people rowing boats. And nice place to quarantine, if you ask me. Anyway, that's the nature we want to sustain. Okay, so this is a book. Number one, so there's your book copy, free, and this was planned in its time as a one-day course in March, but you know what happened to that. So I was first asked, will you do the whole one day on the video? And I said, you're joking, everybody would fall asleep, I'm sure, but we figured that 2 hours where people maybe have a video and could turn it off and on might be sustainable. So this is the 2-hour course for the one-day course for the book, and there are about 100 slides we're going to try and get through, but we will stop in 2 hours and take a few questions, wind down, and we hope you'll pass this, let's see, on. So sorry, but somebody made me a phone call, and how do I turn all that off? Let's see, I don't want to turn off the internet connection at the same time. Okay. Yeah, and we hope that you will, if you start falling asleep halfway, but you're interested, you can pick up the video, which we will announce within a few days at this site here, which is the general site for all the previous 6 videos we have. If you want to catch up on them, there's a list of them. And that's where you'll find the announcement for this video. And we hope you will spread the word to people who are doing charity planning, sustainability planning, environmental planning. Surely you have some friends that might like to plan better. Not everybody wants to plan better. Most people just want to plan simple. And my fear is that these wonderful things like saving the world with the kind of planning language we're using will take 50 to 100 years rather than the 15 to 30 years that we're actually planning and hoping. So in other words, we'll get delayed because we don't understand with greater clarity what the plan is. And that's, in a way, summary of the whole talk. Here's the cover of the free book with the United Nations symbol, and you'll find this on the lapel of, for example, most of Norwegian government ministers have this on their lapel. So people are committed to the ideas with their own understanding of the ideas, but whether we can convince them to have a really clear, focused plan and do the most important things first, that remains to be seen, but at least I'm going to offer some specific analysis of why it is a problem and specific suggestions of what to do about it. And really, it's up to you to maybe get the word out to people who might say, yes, I do want to plan better. By the way, all the ideas here can be used to plan an IT system or any system. But and that would be obvious by looking at the previous courses. So they're the same ideas of how to clarify anything, but I was challenged by a friend of mine to do the magic on the United Nations plans. Here's a one-page summary of the whole talk, and in fact, an attempt to do it with a graphical symbol. Let's see, if this arrow represents some value, like reducing poverty or hunger, and here the poverty and hunger is reduced at this end of the arrow, and here everybody's starving to death and poor as church mouses. And here's where some country or area is on the scale, and we want to get better. We want to reduce it, maybe not perfectly, but within the next, say, 10 or 15 years, be great to get a great improvement. And this arrow represents the degree of improvement of the value, which is any value you choose to focus on, like ending poverty or hunger or bad health or inequality and all these UN goals. So we can express a short-term goal, like a few years, and a longer-term goal, which is getting better and better, using numeric points on this arrow, which we call a scale of measure. The this rectangle here represents a strategy, which means something we do to change things so that we improve. And the word strategy has many synonyms. The simplest one is the means to reach the ends. But IT people would call this a design or architecture or a technology, or more commonly a solution, or maybe just a good idea that if we do it will help us improve things. So that's it in a nutshell. I'm going to be talking about this scale of measure and how we define it so we can put numbers on it and track and manage. I'm going to talk about how we define different points on the scale, so they're interesting and high priority. And I'm going to talk about these strategies and how we decide, like in this case, this strategy gets us halfway to our goal. And so we need more strategy or better strategies to get us the other halfway. And that in a nutshell is all I'm going to be talking about. I've also tried to define sustainability planning. I'll leave you to read it. It's kind of wordy, but it means planning so that you don't lose in the long run by costing too much to maintain or by destroying other values and things like that. Okay. So here is a textbook, which I'll give you a free copy of, called 100 Practical Planning Principles. And these are all the, let's see. Okay. These are all the ideas I'm going to be talking about, but one at a time. And there are 100 practical ideas. Maybe I'll cover 30 of them in this lecture. I haven't really counted. You can use these ideas for your other professional work in IT or computers or whatever. But you can use the ideas in any system, and the system we're interested in is the system of the world's people, making life better for other human beings. So now the method has a name. I call it Planguage, as in planning language. And we have several automated tools. I just saw a new one yesterday, but most of the illustrations are done with the tool made by Richard Smith in Britain called valplan.net. You can look it up, but it gives us a practical tool to put our plans in and for me to display the plans. Okay, and there are other books which I've referenced in the previous books and slides. Anyway, this would be a fairly comprehensive book. Who is supposed to be listening to this? Well, what I've learned is that there are a lot of people out there who don't really appreciate these ideas at all. They want to just keep it simple and fuzzy. Those might be most of the politicians spouting the nice ideas in the United Nations. I think they're not smart enough to appreciate that they could do their things better if they plan better, but they don't want to do that. They don't want to learn anything new. They want to keep it simple. And the fact that their plan will take 50 years to deliver rather than 10 years doesn't really bother them right now. Let's just say they're short-term thinkers. However, in my wanderings through the world, not least giving courses to BCS in London and other places, I've met some exceptionally smart people who immediately grasp what I'm saying and are smart enough to say, I want to use this because I can do better work, and it's very interesting. And so, and I will campaign to spread these ideas at my work or through my consultancy. So those I call exceptionally smart planners. And it's too bad that every planner doesn't react that way and say, wow, let's do it. But that's life. So we are dependent on leaders, exceptionally smart people. I assume that everybody listening who's taken the trouble to tune in is probably in this category. So welcome, but don't expect too much shouting and joy from when you get back to work. People just say, oh, something new to learn, something different. Don't want it, don't need it. We've not needed it for the last 100 years, etc. We need idealists who are idealists in the sense that they just want to do things the best way. That's certainly my hobby and profession of collecting better and better methods. I'm always looking for better ways. In fact, if any of you have any good ideas for improvement of my methods, you've got my email on the first slide. Send me your ideas or examples of other people who have really good ideas. I love to pick up and constantly tweak and tune and improve the ideas. But we need idealists who say, I just want to make the world a better place and I'm willing to sweat for it. We also need people who are what I call champions. And they're the people who walk into a huge corporation like Intel or Ericsson or BT, and they say, I'm going to change the nature of how people do planning here. And I'm going to spend years changing it. And it's going to be a long, hard struggle, maybe 10 or 20 years. But at the end of 10 or 20 years, I'll look back and say, it has changed. Things are much better. And I made the effort. I'm a champion. And I love the champions of the world. And every large business I refer to in my books and talks has a champion I can name, like Eric Simmons at Intel or Polly at Ericsson and Windsor at Boeing, etc. So the world is, in other words, I can hand over to the champions, but I can't be there in your environment, like maybe United Nations or your business. You have to say, I'm going to fight the good fight. We need people who realize how bad conventional planning is. I mean, it's atrocious. It's embarrassing. I can't believe that grown people plan this way at the United Nations or in large businesses, but they do. It's easy enough to analyze how bad it is. Just count all the ambiguous words and whatever they write, and you see the situation right away. We'll see some examples of that. But we have to start with, I know that the planning is really, really bad, but what's the answer? Well, I'm going to suggest an answer. Up to you to decide whether you want to do that or you got something better or you don't want to do anything. Now, in this particular case, United Nations is all about literally saving the world and all the people in it. Quickly, meaning within the next decade or two would be great. rather the next 500 years, and effectively, you know, really getting rid of poverty, really improving the health, really giving equality and things like that. So, and I don't think we're positioned to do it with the planning methods we have. You know, it'll happen. Things will get better in the next 100 years, but we might be able to do the same thing in 10 or 20 years if we focused on clear, better plans. So who is wasting their time here? Well, it's the other gang, the conventional thinkers, people who love user stories and yellow stickies, just to tease you a little bit. People who follow convention, what everybody else does, even though half of all the IT projects are failures. People who want to oversimplify. Oversimplify means I mean, simplification is great, but there's a point where it gets so simple that it doesn't work. And that's what we need to avoid. And there are a lot of people who really don't care about the outcome of the projects. They get paid anyway. In fact, if they fail, they might get paid twice, once for failing and once for failing the second time. And there are people who don't really care if the world falls more apart. They're the me generation, and they're not altruistic in the sense of I'm here to be a part of society and help my fellow man. So maybe half of all the participants pull out at this place. They're not this category at all and don't know anybody who is, and they recognize they're this category. Okay, we do need a few champions to do something with these ideas. In my worst moments, I think, well, nothing a whole lot's going to happen before I die, but maybe 100 years from now or 500 years from now, this will all be very popular, and people will point back to old Gilb 500 years ago who championed the methods, but people weren't listening very much, or at least if they're listening, they weren't doing much about it. Sad but true of many a good idea through history, so that's the way it is. What can we offer here? Well, we can start with a summary of what we can offer is in the Sustainability Planning book, which you have a link to there. I have a much bigger book, the Opus Magnum Value Planning, that's like 700 pages. So if you wanted to be top expert, or at least have a handbook with everything in it, and you're a charity, I'll send you this free on request if you're really doing charitable planning. Otherwise, we're selling it off our website. If 700 pages is scary, or even 100 or so pages is scary, here's the one-page summary of everything. Here's the 15-minute TED Talk on everything. Here's even the soundbite, deliver real stakeholder value now. So I can make it short, but maybe this is so short it doesn't really instruct you as to what you're going to do in practice. So we need something longer to move into practical work. Maybe the top boss can say, do that one, deliver stakeholder value now. And you say, how am I going to do it? He said, well, read that book and study it. Okay. So now there are several people, mainly academics, and I'm referred to them here, and in these are decoded in the book and in the presenter notes of the slide, but they've recognized, as I have, that the United Nations planning goals are not very clear. So I'm not the only one who thinks they aren't very clear. I read through these and I said, okay, but are you suggesting exactly what we should do? And the simple answer was they weren't suggesting in any detail constructively. I mean, you know, they probably, in simple terms, they shouted, write clearer goals or write smart goals, but that I'm going to give you a lot more detail on that subject. So that's what we're going to do. What we're going to do is we're going to show you in practice how to analyze bad goals and objectives, and in practice how to restructure them so that they are much clearer, much better for purpose. Now, I have a set of 10 principles of sustainable planning. Here they are. I'm going to do them one slide at a time, get into detail. As Harrington Emerson elegantly pointed out, methods there may be a million and then some, but principles are relatively few. And those who can grasp principles can successfully select their own methods. So this gives you, in other words, by learning a few principles, you'll get ideas that will help you decide exactly which methods you're going to use, mine, other people's, your own, take your choice. But the principles give you a way of selecting from the myriad of advice there is just in the IT area, not to mention the general management planning area. So here's the first principle, that extreme clarity of the goal is fundamental, basic, at the root. That's where we have to start. If you, did better strategizing, better team building, better motivation, but you still have fuzzy, unclear goals, then you will have a great machine or set of methods for delivering somebody's misunderstanding, delivering the wrong thing. I was quite proud of myself during the preparation where I wrote this, thought I'd copyright it just to be safe. The only use of a fuzzy goal is to get political consensus and enthusiasm. So I recognize that. These are not evil. You need to inspire people and give them a vision. The point is, that's not enough. You can't stop there. So the only use of a fuzzy goal is to get political consensus and enthusiasm about people's misunderstandings. So what people get enthused by, that vision, will lead to misunderstandings by almost everybody who interprets it. That's maybe why people like these visions. They get their favorite misunderstanding. And again, good for rallying the troops and getting people to think it's a good idea, but not good enough for, in practice, spending billions and hundreds of thousands of people at work saving the world. So here's a very simple example, goal 10 in the United Nations: reduce inequality within and among countries. Now, that would be nice, wouldn't it? Now, what this doesn't say is how much we're going to reduce. It also doesn't actually define inequality. See? And it has this country concept, which might not be the smartest way of dealing with it. Maybe at the council level, it's interesting, or the religions level, it might be interesting, or languages level, etc. So even this idea of among countries, I have no idea what among actually means. I'm sure you can guess, but can you guess correctly what the writer of this intended? So there's a very simple example of a real official United Nations sustainable planning goal, which is not good enough. Now, second principle, of course, you understand that at this top level of the whole world, we're talking about the whole world, so we need to be general. We can't talk about, Camden Council people sleeping in the streets. That's a little bit too specific, even though we might want to tackle that. So let's take a look at the goal 7 about affordable and clean energy. Ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy. Now, how many of these words are ambiguous? That one, that one, that one, that one, that one, that one, and that one. Now, if you, even one word which is ambiguous is enough to destroy the meaning of the whole sentence. That is, everybody interpreting it in different ways is going to get a different meaning of the whole sentence. Having 3 or more of unintelligible, actually, you're not sure what it means, words in a sentence, is just total disaster. That makes the sentence essentially useless. Forget it. Do something else. Okay? So here's a very simple method for identifying the fact that we have a problem, Houston. Count the ambiguous words. I hope you all ambiguous means you can think of 2 or more different definitions. Affordable, what does that mean? Reliable, what does that mean? Can you think of 2 or more different definitions? Sustainable, etc. Modern, energy, on and on and on and on. Okay. So, and we have to, at some level, the top level, the enthusiastic level, this is not evil. This is good at the top. The problem is getting down to we're going to spend money in a country or in a council to do something. We need to be a lot more specific. We can't just leave it here, and we can't leave it to the individual to arbitrarily decide which of the many ambiguous things they think it is, which it is, just on their own without consultation with anybody else. So second, the principle of generality need not be vague. I'm going to show you a major tool that you'll see several times throughout the course here. So I've taken the word modern energy, okay, and it has two ambiguous words, but it's really one concept. What is modern energy? And we acknowledge it as a general term, but we need to get more specific. So now, first thing we do is we put it in a scale of measure. Here it is, modern energy. This thing called scale of measure, it's a definition of the clean and affordable energy, the ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, modern energy. Here it is too as an ambition level, as a high level. But the main tactic I'm going to teach you is define these words and simultaneously define them enclosed in a scale of measure so that we can put numbers on it. In other words, how much access are we going to get to all of this? So here's your scale. A scale of measure is as simple as saying, instead of just saying the car is very fast, we say, let's use miles per hour as a scale of measure. And the car goes 300 miles per hour. Wow, that's a very clear and impressive idea. So it's the same simple idea as instead of just saying it's very fast, we say it has so many miles per hour. However, what I do in my scales, I take all these fancy, nice sounding words and I put them in square brackets, which says, I know this is a general word, and I know there are different interpretations, but let's see, modern energy. So here are my interpretations of all those general words, and I've decided in my wisdom, and I might be wrong, that modern energy includes electricity, gasoline, diesel, sorry, I didn't say petrol there, wood, and manual generation of energy. Now, I forgot solar energy and wave energy and stuff like that. Well, okay, we can do that. But the point is I've taken my generic and general word and I've taken all the potential misunderstandings or interpretations and I've written them down. Now I can be very specific when I want to. I can say that for a certain objective, I'm talking about electricity and only electricity as modern energy. Or I might say, what about petrol and wood, or wood and manual generation? I can pick any set of these. In other words, and I can be lots clearer about that general word because I've decomposed the general word into a set of specific. Really, this set is a definition, our for purpose definition of modern energy. And as you can see, I've done the same with energy recipients and sustainable energy. There's the wind and the wave and the solar stuff. So, people can agree or disagree, but we should get to the point where for anything you're working with, you can agree for the moment that when we say energy recipients, this is who we're talking about. When we say modern energy, this is what we're talking about. If anybody has any better ideas, they should like changing a law or regulation, negotiate a change. And at any one time, there should be one official, say, United Nations definition or UK definition of what we mean by these things. Okay. Anyway, long story short, by building a scale of measure with what I call scale parameters, and which are the general ideas, which I steal fairly directly from the bullshit level, the politicians level here, the United Nations level. And by taking the time and trouble to define these and make the definition fairly official, I can then use these concepts, we'll see more of it, to be very specific about exactly which objectives or goals I have for the Sudan next year or something like that. Principle number 3. And by the way, here's the all the different 17 principles. Okay. Now, we start off with 17 United Nations principles. So finally we get questions like, why don't we just focus on no poverty and do the other ones when we have time and when this is cracked? And some people might complain and say, well, we'll starve to death before we get rich enough. And so we have to deal with the hunger and the poverty at the same time. And there's a strong argument from every one of these. So in a sense, what the United Nations said, we want to deal with all 17 at the same time. Let's call them concurrent goals. And the question is, which ones will get the most funding and which ones will move the farthest along? And the ones that get the most funding have been prioritized. Okay. And what we need to do is, in a sense, deal with all of them simultaneously and then decide which ones will get the most resource, maybe in a certain country, and other resources in other countries. And that's called balancing a little bit. We're balancing, trying to get a little bit of everything and not so much of one that we get nothing of the others. That's called prioritization. And so what I'm trying to point out here is we start off with a problem where we're actually trying to juggle 17 balls in the air simultaneously without dropping them, which is a very tricky business. And I have methods for doing exactly that. That is doing what I call multi-dimensional thinking, multi-dimensional planning, which is what happens when you have several concurrent goals. The value planning book, the 700-page book, has about 60 pages, which is a very short book. And here's a free link to it, which deals with prioritization in some depth for those who'd like to go into some depth about prioritization. Principle number 4. Now, I'm using the UN goal number 8, decent work and economic growth. And here is a recent statement with regards, where they're sort of adding stuff given COVID-19. So it's pretty up to date, what you get on the website, which is down there right now. And what I've done is I've gone through the whole thing and I have underlined and bolded what I call link words. Okay, what are link words? Well, if I say I want to get a faster car by being electric. Now, faster car is my objective. By being is my link word, and electric is my means or my design. Okay, so link words link ends and means, or at least they link two levels of thought, where the lower level contributes to the higher level, and the higher level demands that you do some thinking about the lower level. Now, this is a very practical trick. Go through any text you like, pull up some of the other UN texts and do this as an exercise, and go through it, and almost every sentence has, this is people's style, people's custom, has link words, where very clearly on the one side of the link word is an objective or a goal, however fuzzy, and on the other side is a means, an architecture, a strategy, or technique. Now, here's the thing. Mixing ends and means at the top level is an extremely dangerous and bad practice, because most people are going to go out there and implement the means which has been suggested without and before they've even clarified the goal. Okay, they'll do that because it's here, it's official, it's United Nations, and why argue with them? And so they won't worry about the fact the goal is unclear. They'll just do the means and say, we did what it said in the United Nations goals. And of course, it isn't the goal, it's just somebody's idea of how we might get there. And the problem is that means could be a bad idea, an obsolete idea, a too costly idea, an idea that has extremely bad side effects on all the other 16 goals. So extremely bad practice, but extremely widespread in management planning, to have a so-called objective or goal that in fact contains the architecture or technology. We need an architecture or technology, but we need to review all the interesting possibilities. We'll get back to that in this talk, and pick a really smart possibility, which could include ideas that did not exist or were not technically or economically viable when the original plan was made. In other words, the moment you pin down a technology and then go into a 10 or 15-year planning process, you have, in a sense, eliminated future technology and developments could be much cheaper, much faster, much better. Okay, so we need to studiously focus on the goals themselves, the good values we want to get, the ending the hunger, etc., and leave the detail of planning the strategies to local, later strategy planners. Okay. Anyway, here's the trick. So you immediately at a meeting can spot the fact that there is a mixture of ends and means, and it's look for the so that, in order to, through, and these kinds of words which I've given here, link words. If that one trick is probably worth listening to the whole 2-hour lecture. Try it out next time you see bad planning and you want a little trick for identifying the ends and means and pointing out that it's too early to decide on the means. One of the problems, of course, is when the CEO himself has decided on the means in good faith, doesn't realize how dangerous it is. We've got some examples of that stuff too. Principle number 5, it's about side effects. Now, actually, I hear very little in the United Nations planning and very little, most other places about side effects. But in good engineering practice, engineers say, I have this technology, but maybe it costs too much. Maybe it weakens the bridge in time. Maybe it offends religious sensibilities. And so maybe, although it's a good idea primarily, it has some side effects which are so nasty that we shouldn't do it, or if we do it, we'll wish we didn't. So there's an engineering practice that says, okay, pick an idea, let's say the strategy for ending poverty, and wow, that gives us 95% of the poverty goal. Wonderful. But what about the side effects? Well, here's side effects on the other United Nations goals like end hunger, hungry lives, quality education. We've estimated the side effect of strategy to end poverty, which has some detail about it elsewhere. It makes a nice little contribution to end hunger. Good. Positive side effects are good things. But it has a negative side effect on healthy lives. Oops, maybe we'll kill some people while we're ending poverty. And it doesn't have a lot of good effects one way or the other. It has some unknowns down here. Okay. Now, in simple terms, once we've got numeric scales of measure of how good we're going to be for all the goals, we can ask, to what degree will this strategy not only help us here in our primary goal, but to what degree will it influence, for good or bad, or with unknowns, all our other goals? And it should be possible to get an overall view, and saying that, for example, this one, for example, might have not only a pretty good effect, it has an unknown effect right here, but it has an awful lot of good side effects and no bad side effects. That tells you that you might favor or prioritize this. Now, the side effects idea can be compared to the side effects of a chess piece in position and all the things it can affect. I just give you that as a way of thinking about it. Okay. Anyway, I'm trying to introduce multi-dimensional thinking and decision-making, which we have to do the moment we accept the idea that we have 17 United Nations primary goals. And it makes planning life a lot trickier. Anybody can take a ball and throw it up and down and catch it. I can do 2 or 3, but 17 tennis balls, I would drop a lot. I can't juggle 17, although I'm sure professional jugglers can get close to doing something like that. So now this table is actually a technology that I've developed. I call it an impact estimation table, and it helps me keep track of 17 maybe primary architectures, 17 primary goals, and all their side effects. So I can ask the side effect question, or I can ask somebody to research it before I take a decision. The danger is we don't look at side effects, and we just go for the thing that looks extremely good on the primary effect. And then we get into trouble because of this minus 42% negative effect destroying healthy lives that we didn't think of. It just occurred and somebody criticized it, and then years of planning and implementation are totally wasted because we now realize this is useless because of this. Side effect analysis by engineers is an attempt to find out problems long before they happen so that we can avoid them and they don't happen. Okay. Principle number 6. Sustainable planning requires engineering. What does engineering mean? It means systematic ability to deal with very many related factors, all the stakeholders, all the many technologies, all the detailed decompositions of the technologies, all the quantified top-level goals, which are all related to one another. And this is just the top level, which is actually quite simple compared to when you start decomposing it into pragmatic detail. And so you need tools to, like the table I just showed you, to keep track of these. So this is an engineering tool called an impact estimation table. And you need tools like quantifying all of these goals so we can estimate and measure how good all these strategies are. And this is what I call an engineering method. So I wrote a book I'm willing to give you called Competitive Engineering, which is the definition of language, which shows you this engineering method in depth. But now a lot of you say, wait a minute, Tom, I'm a programmer and I'm not an engineer, and I wasn't very good at maths at school, and I like to keep my life simple. Well, sorry, you, if you're not going to make this step, are incapable of handling large problems like saving the world, or maybe saving the National Health Service, or something like that. Okay, so you can't do that. We all know that certain problems require engineering and architecture, and it's formal and it's detailed, and saving the world is one of those problems. So I'm laying it on here. We have to convert to a culture called engineering in order to handle such large problems. If we keep it at the primitive blah, blah, blah management bullshit level where it is now, we will do a lot of expensive stuff for many years, but it will fail, or it will fail to deliver as much as we want as soon as we want, because we didn't use engineering. If you use log cabin building methods to build a 200-story skyscraper, guess what? Principle number 7, which I already illustrated, but let's take it a little bit more detail. Here's our impact estimation table. On this axis, we have a bright idea. Here's just the name of it. We can access the detail of it when we want to. Here's another bright idea. And here's an estimation of how good is this bright idea for my disaster protection goal of moving from 50 to 60 on this scale of measure. And it turns out this goal gets me halfway. Wonderful. But it doesn't get me the other halfway. Well, wait a minute. This goal also gets me halfway. And maybe this halfway is the other half. For all I know, maybe doing this and this gets me all the way. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe this just does the same as this, so I can do this or this, but there's no point in doing both. But we can analyze it. Now, let's just start out by saying these two have equal impact on the only goal I'm looking at. So it's a toss-up. I could do this or this. Let's take another analysis of this. How much is this going to cost from a budget we've set? Doesn't matter what the budget is, but we all know how to quantify budgets. And the answer is this T 1.5.1 will cost 88% of my budget. Now that's fine, but it does mean I have 12% of my budget to do the other 50%. So let's hope I get lucky. This one is comparatively cheap, just 13%, which gives me a whole lot of budget to deal with the other. So I think I would prioritize doing this instead of this on the grounds that it's cheaper. And this looks very, very dangerous. I've actually computed the value to cost ratio, and it's 3.8 here and it's 0.6 here. So what we're looking at is the profitability of a design or a strategy. Another word for profitability is the cost effectiveness. And another word for that is the efficiency of a strategy. So we should be able to compute the efficiency of a strategy and maybe decide that we will select and prioritize and sequence the delivery of the most cost-effective or efficient strategies we can find. So this is just intentionally a very simple model with 2 strategies, 1 goal, not 17 yet, but we'll get there, and 1 cost, and there are more costs than 1. But it shows you the basic principles of estimating on an impact estimation table. So this is a modeling technique, make no mistake about it, in case you want to model a problem like save the world. Principle number 8. We need to plan to learn what works and doesn't work as we're implementing this in Camden, getting the people sleeping on the streets off the street and getting them fed, whatever we're doing. We need to learn fast what works. For example, as I recall, there was recently an effort in Britain to get people sleeping on the streets off of the streets, and then suddenly they're back on the streets because we ran out of budget. And we learned that we have to have a budget to do it, otherwise it can't be done. But maybe somebody could have figured that out a little bit earlier before they just simply ran out of budget. They didn't. So here we have what we call the our cycle of learning. It's very, very close to a plan, do, study, act cycle from Deming, Duran, Shewart, and that lot. Got a little bit more detail in it, like we're very specific about stakeholders and values and design and decomposing the designs and things like that. And finally, measuring the implementation and learning whether the implementation works or not. Now, what I've learned, and we certainly learned during the coronavirus situation, is we have this tremendous problem, massive unknowns about the new virus and how it works. And so we've had to learn as we've gone along, and governments have had to experiment with the lives of people in old age homes on the table and figure out what works and what doesn't, and as quickly as possible, like same day, same week, correct what doesn't work. So there's a very good example of learning by doing of necessity. And they do it by test, as World Health Organization says, or measure, measure. And then they sit down and say, what did we learn? And do we need to, how many people will die if we don't implement it today? Announcement from the government, okay? So we need to plan to learn fast if people are dying at the rate of hundreds or thousands per day. Okay, clear as a bell. Now, there's a well-known engineering paradigm called design to cost. Look it up, Google it. It basically says that if you have a limited budget for people on the streets of London, then if you take the limited budget and divide it by the number of people sleeping on the street, you know how much you can spend per person sleeping on the street. And you say, but the actual cost of getting off the street is 5 times more. Well, you're going to have to find a cheaper way of getting them off the street. Then you're doing design to cost. Now, what I'm bringing in here is a new and more advanced, you can say, agile concept here. Dynamic means we learn in very rapid cycles, like every day, every week, every month, not at the end of a 15-year UN project. That's too late. Dynamic means that every cycle we take, we measure, and then we learn, and that means we change our strategies and modify them to things that were measured to work better, and we avoid strategies that are measured to not work as well. Anyway, I call that dynamic design to requirements. And the requirements here are both the values of getting better and the costs and resources. Okay. Okay, and there's a whole set of principles which I won't go through. You can read them when you're ready for that. Principle number 9. If we're going to get real interesting results that are worth bragging about as a politician, for example, then we need clearer plans. Here's a group called Business Energizers, which are very clear about the fact that getting clear is the first stage of getting results. Quite like this. I picked it up today from the internet. And the United Nations goals are not clear, so our first stage is getting clear. Now, I don't have any realistic hope of the United Nations calling me up after having seen this talk and said, Tom, come and help us, or can we use your methods? I mean, the answer is yes, and I'll help you and you can use the methods. Let's just say that's a horribly large bureaucracy, and I don't think it's going to happen. My best hope is maybe somebody within the bureaucracy will start mucking about with these things. That could happen. But more likely, as we take, many people are taking these principles into their organization. Like there's a very large electricity supplier in London that is using these plans, and they need to take the plans into their organization. So what they can do is translate these fuzzy goals into specific plans to support those goals, but for their organization. Now that can happen. And Camden Council can make more specific plans feeding off of these higher level ideas, ignoring whether the UN makes them clear or not, doesn't really matter as long as we make them clearer locally. So so here we have actually the different goals here: the poverty, the hunger, the healthy lives. And here is how bad we are. That's the left-hand number. And here's how good we want to be in the future, 100% of being good on some scale of measure. Okay, so we have quantified each and every one of these, so they are clear. There's nothing to be misunderstood about them. So now when we pick strategies, we can clearly decide, if we know anything about those strategies, how good they are. This is very, very good, very, very good, very, very bad, red -42%, unknown, etc. But we can make a determination with all the side effects and all the costs, how good or bad any strategy is, because we started with clear, well-defined, quantified goals and resources. Okay, so now if we just jump to the stage of finding strategies, which the UN is already suggesting for us, although they shouldn't, and we want to say, how effective is that strategy going to be? Is it going to be effective enough to reach the fuzzy goal by a very non-fuzzy year, 2030? And the answer is, if you don't have a numeric goal, if you just have a fuzzy goal like end poverty, then you cannot make a numeric estimate of how good any strategy is. You can just say, I think it'd be damned good, but how good it's going to be for end poverty, which is undefined, you can't say anything about it. You can't decide anything about it. You can start using the strategy. You can spend billions of dollars and decades, and maybe it'll work well, and maybe it won't. But the whole point of planning is to suss out these problems and sort out understanding, so you make pretty good prioritizations of which strategies are probably going to work pretty well. And you don't have to learn everything after 10 years and 10 billion pounds of effort that the method, a strategy you have doesn't work. That's what IT people do if you look at failed projects for IT, but it's not a very smart thing to do when people's hunger, poverty, and health are at stake. A little bit more respect, please. Principle number 10. We need to get quick wins, as management like to say. Now, we're actually touching upon the Agile method, which likes to chop things up and get quick wins. But the quick wins should be measurable wins, that poverty should really be going down, health should really be going up, and we need to accumulate, add up our winnings to make sure we're really going in the right direction. And if we start implementing small strategies that are supposed to win, but they don't. We have to stop, learn, think, change as rapidly as we can. So here, by the way, is the big picture. In other words, here's a big picture of all the different strategies we're thinking of using. We've decomposed the strategies, more about that later, to very small strategies. These strategies in the scope of, say, a council or a small country like Norway, maybe we could do them in a week or a month. Okay, the whole world, even these might take a few years. But so we can take big ideas and we can systematically decompose them into smaller ideas and keep on decomposing until we get to a stage where we've got something we can do this week for the coronavirus, because it really is a this week, this day type of thing, even though it's huge in scope. We can't just let 30 weeks go by and until we measure something and figure out that the vaccine doesn't work or something like that. So let's see, I think enough of that. What I'm trying to do is bring up the decomposition of strategies idea so that strategies are so small and self-contained that we can try them out. And if they work, we can scale up, spread them to all the councils in Britain, to all the countries of Europe, except Britain, etc. So the book has a number of chapters in it. I'm done with the principles, and we're about halfway through, and that's fine. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what the book says, but if you want more detail, going to the book, we'll give it to you. Now, so here is goal number 1.5. That means it's a subset of end poverty. There we go, end poverty. And here, somebody plugged in a thing they call targets. Targets are an attempt to make this measurable. Now, if that were true, if this was made measurable by these three, I'd say that's great. The problem is, this isn't even well enough defined to decide whether any of these measures are a fair and reasonable measure of what we have finally decided this means. This is just filled with about 20 pitfalls. In other words, ambiguous words like reduce, by how much and when, extreme, what is extreme, other, economic disasters. What are, okay, so this is just filled with ambiguity. So let me state a very simple principle here. If this is just 20 ambiguous things, not a clear idea at all, it is logically premature to start deciding how we will measure this undefined, unclarified, unagreed goal will be measured. What they've done is they've just picked something from United Nations statistics that said something about deaths or something like that, and said we could measure that because it's here, because we measure it. But and who knows, it might be a relevant measure, but I cannot know until these things are until the actual value is defined. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to get at here. You have got to clarify the value and the scale of measure. I use the scale of measure to clarify, to define it, before you can decide whether the scale of measures are going to be useful or at all or not. So this is just a shot in the dark. But if you're undisciplined and not so very intelligent, you might get fooled into thinking these are three solid measures of this particular sub-goal of end poverty. And they're not. We're fooling ourselves. Now, here's another one. Here is this, number one means it's the poverty goal. These are subsets or decompositions. So I've taken 1.3 and made it a little bit more readable. Now, you'll notice that almost all of these have the problem I've been pointing out, a lot of highly ambiguous. I mean, what do we mean by nationally appropriate? Okay, what is a protection system? on and on and on. So these are what they're doing is they're taking the high-level goal, no poverty, or end poverty in all its forms everywhere, and they're trying to define it by a thing they call targets. Okay, and they start off by at least indicating a deadline for the target, which is pretty good. But then, and they even have a number here for poverty levels, $1.25 a day. But then they fall into the trap of not doing anything quantitative or clear in the whole rest of the target. They just keep on plugging in the deadline and think, well, that's quantified, isn't it? We're quantified, aren't we? And the answer is you still have an awful lot of unintelligible goal here. But then they drum up all these indicators. Here are the indicators for 1.5. Here are the indicators for 1A. In other words, the same problem as I was showing on the previous slide. You have an attempt to get poverty defined as about 7 different targets. You'd think that was a measurable thing with numeric indicators, and we're still just fooling ourselves. We still have at a second level, first level, no poverty. Second level, this stuff, total lack of agreed, clear definition that we could measure. It's a little bit too early to decide what indicators, or I just call these muddled measures, okay? I call these visions, and it's okay to have visions as long as the people on the ground floor, the shop floor, take those visions and decode them into very specific measurable scales of measure. How much in Camden Council by 5 years from now are the kind of questions we need to answer here. Okay, so again, I'm just, I'm showing you the real problem. This is the UN muddling along. Now, here's an attempt to clarify it by just getting one scale of measure. Here's the scale of measure, and here's a number on it. Now, I'll make a long story short and then push on. This was a little bit too simple, even though it was a scale of measure. So long story short, I could spend 10 minutes explaining why I don't like it, why I don't think it's good, but I'll move on and say I did that as a draft, and then I said I don't like it, I think it's not good enough. And I went on to other things, which is this one. So here we have the statement from the United Nations. This is the target, the subset of ending poverty. This is the disaster protection poverty target, 1.5. And here it is. Now, what I've done, I've written in bold all the words that I'm pretty sure need better definition. They're ambiguous. They're not good enough. And then I've written a draft scale of measure. And notice what I've done in the scale of measure. Where it says build, I've got a little, what I call scale parameter called building. And where it mentions resilience, I've got a little generic term called resilience. Now, when I write something in a scale with scare brackets, I've written what I call, because I've invented this method, a scale parameter. What it is, it's a general term which I recognize is ambiguous, and therefore the ambiguity needs to be resolved. But notice that this scale is very, very close in sequence and content to the ambition level. So that's actually another practical trick. Take the bullshit ambition level, United Nations has written them, and then analyze it for ambiguous words. And then, if you like, plug those ambiguous words into a draft scale sentence, okay? And then take resilience and write down all the ambiguities, like avoiding, escaping, resisting, recovering, and take vulnerable and write down poor, physically exposed, weak health, no network fallback, insufficient insurance. Now, it turns out that what we're doing is we're taking vulnerable and we're defining it by a set of things which are specific things that this probably means sometime, somewhere, for some purposes. Okay, so we're defining it, and actually we've got several levels of decomposition of the whole idea of making the world a better place is these 17 goals, right? Here's the goal 1, poverty. And okay, so first level of decomposition of Save the World is these 17 goals, okay? So each one is a little clearer, a little bit more specific. Now we're taking one of these goals, we've the poverty, we've divided it into the different targets, financial poverty and disaster protection poverty, and there are about 5 others. I've only taken these 2 here. But I've decomposed poverty into sub-goals, and here's one of them, called the disaster protection poverty, 1.5. And then I've decomposed the scale into parameters. And these are all these different variables or words that we need to understand the disaster protection poverty. And then I've taken each one of them, that's decomposition number 3 here, the scale parameters, into conditions. So each one of these, here's an environmental condition, the earthquake happened. Here's another environmental condition, a flood happened. Here's another environmental condition, the avalanche happened. Maybe we have floods and earthquake at the same time, or not to mention, we have had in Bangladesh the coronavirus and the floods. Okay, so 2 conditions can happen at the same time, everybody's worst nightmare. And I've got a number 4 here, which is on the next slide, where we can take something like actually, environmental is a subset of shocks, and I've taken environmental and I've decomposed this to a 4th level. Okay, so we can decompose as much as we want until misunderstanding is impossible. I mean, an earthquake is an earthquake, isn't it? An avalanche is an avalanche. A fire is a fire, more or less. So we're getting pretty clear there. A little bit more detail about the scale parameters. So here are the scale parameters we used. And we built a sort of a sentence, but this is a way of writing a scale with scale parameters. And here are the different conditions. And then for any one goal, I can say, I have a goal for the health, power, and recovery speed, and the resilience known as recovery, and the vulnerable idea known as physically exposed and no network fallback. For situations where an epidemic like coronavirus has hit us, and the shocks we're going to talk about is called the social shocks. So I can choose any combination. Now, one way of thinking about this is a great way of modeling a very complex world, because this is the complexity of our world, and we can put in any additional detail we want or we need for practical purpose. There's no particular limit. We can decompose any number of levels that are interesting, having any number of conditions we want. But these things become extremely well defined, extremely clear, compared to the starting points I've shown you, where it basically just says end poverty, thank you very much. But it doesn't say end poverty for the physically exposed in the tents in the refugee camp. Doesn't get that specific at Moria. Okay, so so this is one of my inventions in language, which helps us become more clearer, deal with very, very complex systems, but maybe one set of parameters at a time, which is highly prioritized. And you'll find that extremely useful as a tactic for clarifying values at a very high level, the visions. But by drilling down to this level, we're getting down to the Camden Council level with drug addicts sleeping out of doors who are starving. So what do we do with these scales? So so here, by the way, is a the ambition level. I've taken the level from the UN with some respect. I mean, I could go back and say UN people are fuzzy idiots, but I don't. I say the UN wrote this, and they mean well, and it's a great vision, but practical people like you and me need to boil it down to something much clearer. So we've learned to do it at the BCS course on sustainability planning. So here, in fact, is our scale. Now, on the scale, we have specific numeric goals. Here are 2 goals. We also have other points on the scale, like how bad things are in the world today. That's called the status. And we even have stretch goals, which my Finnish friends taught me. That's being extremely good, much better than 98%. And we also have tolerable levels, which is below that you have failed. That defines failure formally. Goals define success, actually. Okay. Now, so here we have a goal for situations with family poverty, shocks, climate, and environmental, building health power, resilience, escaping, vulnerable, weak health. And the answer is the goal is 60% by 2030. Now, that is a slice of all the possible goals we could write down, but it might be the slice which is the highest priority to get done early. So in fact, the way I teach people to do this is start writing a goal, and let's take that situations parameter here, and which one of these is the most urgent, the most disastrous if we don't get it right. And somebody says family poverty. Okay, fine. Write down family poverty, and you continue this. The shocks, which conditions are the most urgent, the most, and this is what I do on our training courses at BCS and the workshops we hold for requirements and designs. Exactly how I train people. I say, pick one of these and then go through the conditions and pick the most critical ones for the short term. And that's what you write down as your goal first. Okay. We can take the less critical goals in turn, but here I've identified a set of things which in theory is the most critical thing we need to attack. Now that gives me a slice of the action. And the beauty is this thing here might take only 5% of the budget or 5% of the time, but it might solve 50% of all the problems we have out there. Okay, so this is so by selecting a critical slice of the action using these mechanisms, we get more useful work done for less resources, less time, less money, less effort, and we churn out very big results in the short term. This is also what I call agile as it should be, if you didn't. So we start from this vague point of everything, and we work our way down to maybe 5% of the cost and 50% of the problem, and pin it down. And that's one of, and we have several goals. Later, when we get more capable, we might go for another goal. We might even go for a stretch, which is extremely good. Etc. But so here are a number of different points. These are called benchmarks. These are called targets. And this is called a constraint. You know, you've got to be at least 90, otherwise you fail. But at least 90 for a given set of conditions, which are not necessarily the same here. So notice I've mapped with arrows the ambition level going right into the statement. I'm going from the UN statement directly into something recognizable by a UN planner or employee, the vulnerable or the resilience problem via the scale. So I'm trying to avoid alienating the UN, so we write some goals so technical that nobody can recognize that have anything to do with what the UN said. I'm keeping the UN stuff. I'm just translating it into something operational for Camden Council in the short term or something like that. This idea of decomposition, where I've harped on decomposition of the values, decomposition of the user into stakeholders, decomposition of the designs or architecture. My favorite decomposer is Rene Descartes, and here are some of his decomposers. Okay, so it's not exactly a new idea. Here's decomposition of poverty. But decomposition is a very powerful method, practical method of defining things. So I've defined poverty as this set of things, okay? But it also gives you something to focus on and maybe do this one first and get it done. The moment you attack all of this simultaneously, you've got yourself a 100 billion quid 15-year project, and it might not work at the end of the day. So decomposition allows you to attack high priority targets early and solve the problem before they die of the virus or die of starvation, by the way, and prove that you know what you're doing. Again, this is agile as it should be, decomposing into critical stuff, getting it done measurably. But it's not exactly a new philosophical idea. And we can go much further back than Descartes if we want to. Now, what I've done is I've taken a whole value, let's call it, some of you would call this a requirement. In this context, we can call it a UN goal. Managers would call it an objective. So, but here's the agenda. We have a little form to fill out. We get this form maybe off of a computer or in paper or something. And the first thing step one is we name it. So I've given it a name, and I prefer to use names exactly like the UN used. I don't give them alien names or codes if I can avoid it. So they recognize what we're doing. Okay. Here the computer tool even tells us that this thing here is a subset of poverty. Okay. Okay. So we know that this whole thing is here it is here, 1.5 is a subset of poverty. But the tool keeps track of that and tells us, okay. Here's the scale of measure we've been looking at before. But what I first do is I write down the ambition level, and notice this is exact quote of United Nations bullshit, okay? But there's an awful lot of useful bullshit. It's just that we can't consume it directly. We've got to decompose it into a structured scale of measure. So this is a structured scale of measure. All of these, as you now know, are defined somewhere, actually in the scale window. This is a one-liner to keep it simple. And we were looking at the scale window earlier. There it is. That's the scale window. Okay. And okay. And then we have a very simple idea. The status is how bad we are today for a certain set of parameters, and for exactly the same set of parameters, how good we want to be maybe in the year 2030. 10 years hence. So now we have an extremely clear goal. We've gone through this set of steps. And somebody might say, well, that's all very nice, but what about all the other resilience and vulnerability parameters? What about the whole caboodle by 2030? And the answer is we're at 5. I've written a little tag on the point on the scale, the status and the goal, so I can see that they're related. And we're trying to get to 98% plus or minus 1% by 2030 for all. So now I have a very clear short-term, partial goal in the long term, 2030, and I have a very clear absolutely everything, all the slices goal. Okay, so I can so using this sequence of filling out the form, I can take any requirement or goal, any values, any qualities, and I can spell them out and define them using these things and more, and much more. Okay, but this is a perfectly good example of how to start off with end poverty, or even build the resilience of the poor in those vulnerable situation stuff, and make it clear, unambiguous, measurable, trackable, manageable, really smart requirements, as opposed to those other smart requirements. So here are some added features. I've added the tolerable level, which I mentioned earlier. Again, that's the dividing point. Anything lower than that for this set of everything, it turns out, is failure. And anything as good as that or better is not failure. So I've got a formal definition of whether the United Nations program has failed or not failed. But the goal is a definition of success. And it tells me anything as good as that or better is a successful United Nations effort. And anything less than that, 97.99999, is in a no man's land. It's tolerable. I can live with it, but it is not full success. You've got to get to 98 by our formal agreed definition if you want success. So have you ever wanted to define success and failure so nobody could misunderstand it? So at the end of a project, you could declare success even when some people have decided they want a little bit more than they told you to begin with, and say, we agreed to get to 98. We agreed that was success. You didn't tell me you wanted 99.5, yet we can discuss that from today. But our project has succeeded in delivering the 98 that you wanted before 2030. Therefore, our Agile as it should be project is a success. I'm going to add another language parameter. Here is the one called a meter. Now, meter is like thermometer, voltmeter, and things like that. It is the measuring instrument or measuring process that we have decided and maybe formalized, or the UN has approved or recommended, that we're going to measure on this scale of measure. Notice all the discussions about how we measure whether you have the COVID virus or not, okay? And how many different measurement instruments are out there, some of which are good and bad. So that's very typical. There are, in general, many possible meters, some good, some bad, some cheap, some expensive, for measuring along any given scale, okay? But it is a practical matter to decide which meters we intend to use so that we can afford them and so we have confidence in them, that kind of thing. And there could be several different meters. Here's a short-term meter and the official UN long-term reporting meter, for example. But now what we're doing is we're increasing the specification to talk about the test process. For those of you who deal with tests, this is where the tester comes in. Test, 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 World Health Organization said was the game, okay? Here's another additional thing I haven't talked too much about yet. It is the list of the stakeholders that have very high interest in this particular goal. So we're relating all the different values or goals to the critical few of the maybe 50 or 500 stakeholders that are so interested in this that you could probably ring them up and say, we are changing this goal. You're listed as one of the primary stakeholders. Have you got a few minutes to discuss the change with us? You know, this stakeholder wanted to change to 60, and you might feel differently about it. So this is a little mini tailored committee for the change process and many other uses, keeping track of stakeholders. Right, okay. Now, in addition to these things, there are all kinds of other things you can add to a specification of an objective, or in this case, I've added a whole lot of things that have to do with responsibilities of different kinds for specification and other things. And I call these things are not actually the requirement, but they are in the requirement. So I call them background information. And here the status and the stakeholders and the ambition level are themselves also background. They're not the requirement itself. Requirement itself is, in simple terms, the scale and the goal, just to keep it very simple. So that's what we call the core definition. And but it turns out by adding a whole lot of background information, we get information pinned down and agreed and quality controlled that can help us with a whole lot of other stuff like risk management, priority management, understanding different levels of concern, you know, council, state, nation, European Union, NATO, etc. And it also helps us deal with decomposition, and it helps us deal with quality control and quality assurance. Now, again, I could safely hold a one-day course, as I've done many times at BCS, on each one of these subjects, and they're all defined in great detail in my books, especially the value planning book. So I'm just making an assertion here. There's a whole lot of stuff that when you say, why should I bother to write down issues, dependencies, and assumptions? And the answer is risk management, obviously. Okay. So, here's my belief system with language, that we use the basic core requirement as a place where we build a little database of everything you ever wanted to know about that, so that we can manage it with regard to risk and priority and decomposition and quality control. And if we don't collect this information, put it in one place, make it very accessible, and define it in well-defined, agreed ways. I mean, what is an issue? I define it as a question asked which has no answer yet, therefore it can be a risk. But risk is, question is answered, we know this is risky. What are we going to do about it? We need mitigation. So, okay, so long story short, I introduced to you background specification, which are additional tricks of the trade in language for allowing us to manage the process of saving the world, ending hunger, and things like that. This is actually the ending hunger one. Now, how are we going to present these plans? As true with almost anything, sometimes you plan at a more technical level, but you have to present to the top management for approval in a more easily digestible way. Okay, so language is set up so that you can extract and condense very complex plans, which we have to be realistic, into nice little charts like this, for example. And to do that, you can do it manually, but it's very nice to have a tool that understands these things. This is done in the ValPlan tool, for example. This is done in another tool, which I won't name for the moment. But tools can take a look at the database and say they want it to produce a nice diagram or drawing so it's more intelligible for a top management meeting. And then we might drill down here and drill down here if management wants more detail, or not if they don't want more detail. So long story short, there should be ways of presenting plans at the head of state, the council, mayor level, or whatever. But there should be a possibility for those for the top guy to say, I want the detail, not for me, but for my staff, so they can tell me whether you're fooling me or not, so they can do quality control on it. Here's from the same, this is actually let's call it a startup, which has built a very advanced tool for the building industry, which I think this tool could be used for United Nations planning, actually, because we're building stuff too. And but it happens to use all my language ideas as a base directly from the competitive engineering book. Long story short, it's amazing what automated tools with a little bit of artificial intelligence can do with big data. And if you're planning the whole world, you've got big data flowing through at all times. So let me just introduce that idea. For decades, we've used simple tools like spreadsheets to effectively automate some parts of it, even using simple things like Word, macros to drop down the templates and things like that. We used 15 years ago at Citigroup in London. So we have some very simple automated tools we can build on, but right now we are building and have built very advanced artificial intelligence automated tools, which in my dreams, we will use to save the world and help United Nations and its nations to do so. Here's a good friend of mine. He is a professor of systems engineering and architecture in Norway. He's a Dutchman, Jarrett, and he's going to hold a little session which you can get into there on the 29th of May. but he's very interested in this problem of how incredibly primitive people are writing requirements. They're doing it essentially on paper or Word, and they're using natural language like end poverty, text only. And there is a set of enhancements where we get to, we build a database of it. We build tools on top of the database to look at the models in very sophisticated ways. And we move from natural English to language, which is a formalized language. And we can communicate with very rich analysis and models. So what he's going to do on this is get some industry people to talk about what they're doing and where they are here. And some have moved up here. I think everybody in our business and in the United States, they need to move up to this level for anything as important as saving humanity from hunger, poverty, and bad health. We've got 1800s requirements, quite literally, and I can prove that. And we are in the 21st century with artificial intelligence and computers, and it's about time the United Nations moved up a bit, if nobody else. So here's got half an hour left. It's good. So here's chapter 3 of the book. Now, here's a quotation from Albert Einstein. The perfection of means, meaning better and better technology, and the confusion of ends, meaning fuzzy requirements, seems to be our problem. So the guy died about, was it 54, I think. So if you like, it took a genius to recognize a very old problem, this ends and means, okay? Here's one of them, straight from the United Nations COVID-19 response. There's the exact link. So here we have a fuzzy value, sounds very nice, protecting jobs, supporting medium-sized enterprises and informal workers through, that's the link word, economic response and recovery programs. Now, sounds good. I mean, definitely problems here. Definitely we need to do something rather than nothing, and economic responses and recovery sounds good. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, the fastest, cheapest, most effective thing to do would be motivation of a government or of people. And you didn't have to spend billions, and you didn't have to have a so-called recovery program. You just motivated people in a different way. Well, that's not here in this list. But the United Nations has specifically said we do and encourage nations to do economic responses and recovery programs. I think through, and what should be here is the best, most cost-effective ways of getting shit done early. And we should forbid people including United, to suggest specific ideas. These are 2 ideas out of 100 possible ideas, and I suspect the other 98 might contain some of the most cost-effective ideas you can imagine. Okay, but there are people out there who like very expensive programs for a long time. Okay, like governments who want to siphon off a lot of the money, or contractors who want to earn a lot of it themselves. So be careful. There is, as Eisenhower said, a military-industrial complex that might be nudging you in the wrong direction for their own selfish means. And I'd like to think that smart planning would somehow try to avoid the big, expensive responses, which are not the smartest way of doing things. So here again are this is from goal 14. We've analyzed goal 1, but this is goal 14. And I've, same crap again. Here we have goals, including goals as short as now and 5 years hence, but filled with the link word. In other words, filled with words, sustainably manage and protect to avoid significant diverse impacts. So, I mean, what does significant mean? And what impacts are we talking about? And what exactly is adverse for the stakeholders we're talking about? So again, total bullshit. We have to clarify these things. we have to, once having clarified these things, we have to select the smartest strategies humans can think about, even though they might not be pork barrels and billions for corrupt governments to siphon off to their Swiss bank accounts. Unfortunately, there might be something really cheap and simple to do, but some people are not interested in that. Okay, so I've written down some principles, which time does not permit me to go through all of these, but they're there in writing. But let's stick to this one: clarify and use link words to figure out when you're staring strategies in the face that shouldn't be there at all, let alone officially from United Nations. Then there's the problem of who is responsible. I mean, is United Nations responsible for United Nations goals? If the electricity company in London has decided to tackle the goals, are they responsible for decoding the unclear goals of United Nations, or can they just let the bullshit stay there and then dive in and do something that they were already doing anyway and say, aren't we nice people? Okay. So I think we need to be clearer about assigning responsibility for the, I mean, who is responsible for this goal? And is somebody else responsible for this goal? And they need their name on it as an institution, an organizational entity, a person, whoever they might be. So long story short, we need to add into the specification who is responsible for what. And they need to know that they are identified as responsible. And my experience with this is the moment people know they are responsible and that their name is on it, they take it a lot more seriously than if Mr. Nobody is responsible. So here are some examples of types of people in the culture of value analysis and value design that I've done my earlier courses on. And so these, we could have a value analyst for United Nations goals and a value architect for strategies for United Nations goal fulfillment. And value design builders are the people who build the architecture for delivery of United Nations and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, these become specific type of people that can take responsible, for example, for the formulation of this goal with this scale. Let's call them the value analyst. And then when we get as far as the design and stuff like that, we get people who are responsible for the implementation or for the architecture. It's time to begin thinking about how do you train a value analyst so they can do this stuff. Again, we've given training in these BCS things, and we've done it for over 7 years live at the BCS with the help of the quality specialist group sponsoring us, and now the SPA also sponsoring us. So we've some people gone out there and actually done things from the BCS courses. We've been able to track and trace wonderful people like Trevor Lee Cox, for example, is out there making it happen in practice as a result of the BCS courses. So, but these are just some examples of responsibilities we could define and then write down as responsibility and owner and stuff like that in the background of the specification. Chapter 5, okay. There's this notion of constraints and costs. Now, constraints is anything that stops us from using a certain strategy or having a certain value. They just say it's illegal, okay? But and there are two kinds of constraints. There are what I call binary constraints, like it's illegal or it's not our policy. And there are variable constraints, like you have to reach a certain level of non-poverty, otherwise you have failed. And so those are the tolerable levels on these scales here, okay? And then there are costs, or look at the bigger picture, I usually call this resources. So here's a set of various resources. These are typically short-term for building and delivering the value, and then they are longer-term for maintaining the value year by year, decade by decade. That's the whole basic idea behind sustainable, is the costs don't suddenly escalate once you've delivered the system to 10 times higher and making the whole change unsustainable. So especially with sustainable projects, it's very important to look at the even the short-term costs, because the short-term costs will be incurred council by council, nation by nation. So we need to control those so that the ideas people are going to repeat the use of, the different vaccines for the virus are sustainable. But then there's the long-term notion that also has to be sustainable, that we don't have hidden costs like technical debt in IT just exploding by a factor of 10 times the cost of the whole project, making us want to throw it away and start again. So long story short, we need to take the set of critical resources and set budgets for them, like annual recurrent costs of time, talent, people, and money. And then for each column here represents a strategy where we've evaluated the values above it. I showed you that earlier. And now we're going to evaluate the different costs. And we can even sum up the different costs here in various ways and get an overall figure of how much cost consumption there is. This looks like the cheapest guy around, which leads to value to cost ratios, which are green, meaning the smartest and most cost-effective strategy is this one. Okay, so notice that our spreadsheet, and you can do this with any spreadsheet, you don't need any other tool, is computing the values over the costs, and it's picking out a winner with a value to cost ratio. I'm not getting into the detail of how we add up the costs and values. There's a fairly simple mechanism, but that goes beyond what I want to talk about at this short 2-hour course, but it's all in the books. So what happens here is we compute the priority. That is, I will prioritize this strategy because it's got a value to cost far in excess, almost by an order of magnitude or close, to any other strategy. So this is the strategy I want to do in the short term. It's cheap, it has very good impacts, and I can choose this as my first value delivery step in the short term at low cost. See how things work. Okay, so, but long story short, the thing I wanted to bring up here is we need, in our engineering model, we need to be formal about the costs. Now, everybody knows how to quantify costs, so that's not the problem. But we need to be mature enough to identify, for example, long-term recurrent costs, because people don't do that. They just are so happy to have built it and they run away from it, and it's somebody else's problem, like a nation, to pay for the bad strategies the UN suggested, and they have to pay for the next 40 years, bad ideas. So somebody needs to look ahead and say, what are the recurrent costs? And let's choose strategies that have visibly low recurrent costs, because not everybody is rich, like Norway. Here's another model of the same thing. Here are the resources. Here are recurrent resources, like annual maintenance costs. And here are upfront initial costs, but which may be recurrent if you're doing it council by council, country by country. You are recurring the initial startup costs for any idea we have there. So it becomes worth controlling and managing those costs so they're as low as we can design them to be. Here's a gang I admire. This is IBM Federal Systems Division, who mastered the art many decades ago of delivering extremely complex space and military projects on time, under budget, every time. And they're worth studying. So you'll find links to them here and there. But one thing they did that I want to point out here is they collected data, history data, for all their previous projects, so they could learn from history. And the UN does collect a lot of statistics. What I pointed out is, unfortunately, maybe some of those statistics are not, maybe none of them are relevant for today's new problems. But to the degree they are relevant, we do need to collect data. Now, what the UN may or may not do They may collect statistics on how hungry people are or poor they are, but they may not be able to sort those statistics by strategy actually used, especially if that strategy is a new strategy, like a new coronavirus, which has got no track history, and they're not geared up to suddenly start collecting data on that factor. Anyway, long story short, an intelligent engineering system will collect historical data and use that for planning. The same system will measure and learn at every cycle of implementation. And if they're getting an answer like yes, then they continue the cycle, more and more of well thought out things. But if they get a no answer like no, this virus is not preventing the vaccine is not preventing the virus, then we have to go out and find ourselves a new virus and start again. So this is basically the Gilb Evo cycle, or the Deming plan, do, study, act cycle happening. With but the beauty here is that it's done on very complex projects, and it is an example of the dynamic design to cost I talked about earlier. So, quarter of an hour left, not too bad. Chapter 6, we're looking at the strategies themselves, the bright ideas. Here's an example of writing down first a summary and then a more detailed description of a top-level strategy, 1.5, disaster resilience, and keeping it in a digitized form, so we can see digitally how everything is related. And we use the digitized form, not least a good platform for printing out more readable graphical overviews of what's happening. But that's how a strategy might look. Chapter 7 is, I think, talked about earlier enough that we can skip over it, but it's the idea of how do you evaluate strategy effectiveness. And so here's our strategy, which we have some details on from there. And here's our value, where we've detailed the scale of measure and how bad we are and how good we need to be by 2030. And then we estimate how far we can move from 50 to 60. And the answer was 5 points, so that gets us to 55. But another way of looking at it is that we're getting 50% of the way to the goal. And we look at that and say, well, this strategy is effective, because 50% is not 5%, it's not 0.5%. It is, in fact, very effective. And in fact, if we found one more strategy equally effective to fill the gap there, we would have solved our problem. This is a way of looking at architecture and design, that we're looking at the design ideas, and we're asking ourselves, to what degree do they fill the big gap, 100% getting to the goal? This is the gap we're looking for. Those gaps need to be numeric, and we need to estimate how good our technology is, in this case, hunger and poverty technology, for getting us to the goal. And for that, we need maybe UN statistics, maybe other statistics, and maybe to generate some new statistics to give us the information about how good that idea has been in practice when we use it. As you might have seen, I have two different numbers here. One I call the real number. That's on our scale of measure. 5 says, well, we're going to get to 55. We're going to move up there. But I also like to compute what that means in terms of percentage of the way to the goal. So we have a second number that we use for other purposes. And it simply says, well, forget the scale of measure and forget the detail of 5. Just tell me, am I getting all the way to my goal, or do I have a design gap? Do I have more design to you, do a better design? Okay, so we convert all the real numbers, which keep us grounded in reality of the situation, the reality being defined by the scale of measure, and we look at it from an abstract point of view of what percentage of the way is our project towards our goal. And I just wanted to point out there are two different numbers and they each serve different purposes, and it's good to have both numbers. This one is usually computed quite automatically from a tool or a spreadsheet, and otherwise you have to compute it manually. Let's see. Here's goal for goal 9, which has to do with innovation and stuff like that. Foster innovation. Something different. Notice the bullshit words here, and notice we've there's the bullshit innovation, but we have found ourselves a scale of measure with parameters like innovation types and industrial sectors and locations, and you get some sample of innovation types include new construction methods, industrial sectors, construction industry, and locations, Norway. Okay, and so that's now the point is, this is, I have another name I want to bring up at this point. I call it poetry. Now, I love poetry. I love visionary words. So does the United Nations. And we've got to recognize and call it by the name. This is okay, this poetry, at a certain level. But the United Nations itself, in my opinion, should have taken the trouble to point out that this is poetry, and to recommend, for example, some scales of measure, okay, which people could tailor and change if they want to. We have to move from poetry to logic to engineering to get real stuff done, to real degrees of change in real time. This will never have any other effect except people getting motivated to do their misunderstanding, and the stakeholders, here they are, will not be happy because they will have their own different misunderstanding of what was supposed to be done for 100 billion quid in 10 years. Okay, so main point here, poetry has its place, and it even has its place in the United Nations and governments and politics, but somebody like us responsible planners have to know that it can and should be and must be planned. I usually take 10 such goals and do them in one day, by the way, in practice, and we teach that on the BCS courses, and we do them in one day. So it's not like it takes a long time to get much clearer plans much earlier. Now, when we're evaluating this 50%, you might have wondered at how do we know it moved to 55 or it moved 5 points or got 55? And I'll open a window on this cell in the table, and here's some more detail about what's really going on. But in simple terms, we say, hey, you said this technology would move us 5 points. Here's the 5-point estimate, that the delta or change is 5. Fine. Now, how do you know? This is what I also call my 12 tough questions. Some of you might remember from previous lectures. And that's called evidence. And in law and in science, we have a thing called the evidence for an assertion. And I'm suggesting we need to bring that in so that people don't just say, I believe it's damned good, because that's what's going on right now all over the place. You say, I believe it'll get us halfway to our very specific goal of 60%. And I believe that because here is my evidence. It's been done before in at least 100 UN nations, and it always gets to at least 55%. Well, that's very good evidence. And by the way, you may be cheating on me. Even scientific research people cheat to get doctoral degrees or, heaven forbid, Nobel Prizes. And so I want to know the source. Where can I look this up? Where can I quality control that this is the truth, that it really says that this strategy got to 55% really in 100 UN nations? So this is the basis for quality control. And now it turns out this is, we have a concept here called credibility, where zero credibility is you're just throwing out an assertion and belief with nothing to back it up. And 10 or 100% credibility is the same as saying, you know, this is absolute repetitive truth. You can win a Nobel Prize on it. It's science. It will happen every time. So this particular assertion, we've rated at 9 on the credibility scale. That means it's been done many times before. many places, and it relates directly to what we're saying here. So it's damned close to 100% credibility. What do we do with this credibility number? We multiply it times this. And so if you're just bullshitting, 5 times 0 gives you nothing. And if you've got a very high credibility, then this will survive. This is a way of doing risk management, to make a long story short. Here's another risk management idea. You say 5, but if you look at the range of what's going on here, could it be as low as 3 or as high as 7? That's called plus minus 2. So there is a risk that there is a spread, that the answer isn't exactly 5. And we're forcing people to think about the risk that it isn't exactly 5 by giving us a less exact number, a range of things. So long story short, this is how we, in engineering fashion and very close to scientific fashion, deal with these estimates, so that we know whether we've got a lot of good estimates or a lot of bad estimates before we make our decision. And there's a lot more about this in the books and in the, especially the value design course. We go a lot more deep into these things. But I think United Nations planning should, for the strategies they're selecting, give us the evidence and not just say United Nations has suggested this. They haven't told us why they suggested it, but they have done it. Therefore, we'll do this for 100 billion quid for 10 years, even if it doesn't work, because then we can blame United Nations. We don't have to take any responsibility for thinking what we should do. Shame, shame, shame. Okay. So here, by taking the percentage of this and the percentage of this, we can compute a value to cost, 0.6. And by doing this with the other strategy, 50 divided by 1.3, giving us 3.8. So long story short, we can, using the percentage things and the sums of the percentages actually sum up more or less, we can compute with a spreadsheet or a tool the value to cost ratio. And we can modify this with things like the credibility number and the plus minus gives you a worst case. So, so what I'm saying is, pointing out with this slide is we use the percentages as a tool to summarize 17 different values and 6 different costs and make sense of, give us a cost effectiveness metric, which is rough, but a lot better than just doing what United Nations said, even though they don't tell you why, and nobody analyzed what the values are, and nobody analyzed known effects. So now there are 3 minutes left, which I think I set an alarm for approximately that time, and we do have some other nice stuff, but not much. And so I'll just scan through it, and you can have a bit of fun. But I'm going to wind down. My 3-minute alarm went, and if we'd done a 2-day course, I would definitely be able to squeeze in the other stuff. It's all very nice, but you've got the main stuff. So here's the last slide, and there's the book link. These slides, exactly as they are, is actually at this link in PowerPoint, and almost exactly in PDF at this link. I'll update that later, and we will shortly have a video, so you can repeat it or share it with friends, and you can share this stuff freely with anybody. I've decided that this book is going to be free forever. Never charge any money for it. Hope that's my little contribution to saving the world, I hope. And if somebody really smart and energetic picks it up and changes the UN planning, I'll be able to say, I did start the chain reaction of making the world a better place, and I'll feel very good about it when I'm 100 years old in 20 years. Let's hope maybe that person is listening or knows that person who's listening. There's my email for suggestions, questions, and complaints. And there's my Twitter handle if you want to Twitter that everybody should be listening and looking at this. And when the video comes, I will put it on Twitter and my LinkedIn. So thank you very much. I'm done because I did design to cost. And any questions? I'm now listening in for Immo to come back online, or Margaret. Yes, I hear you, Margaret.
Oh, sorry. Imon, are you there?
Yes, I've just given everybody the freedom to unmute their microphones to ask questions if they wish.
This was fantastic. Thank you very much, Tom.
Totally right. I mean,
you're welcome. Thank you for asking me, Margaret and Immo.
You've pointed out how people are handling enormous budgets and enormous responsibility with very unscientific methods.
Yes.
It occurs to me that there are a number of petition sites these days, like change.org and 38 Degrees and so on. Has anybody started a call to actually adopt these measures?
Okay, now one little background thing I didn't mention, but I will mention it. There's a thing called Norwegian Christian Aid.
Yes.
Okay, and decades ago, Kai and I spent 2 years training them in this planning for things like peace processes and getting the rebels back to their villages safely without being killed by the government. Yes. And water wells in Eritrea, and you actually find evidence of that in my competitive engineering book.
Okay.
So, and they loved it, and they trained all their planners all over the world to use it. So I know from personal experience that these methods work excellently, and the top managers of the organization love it because they're able to present their plans and get better plans early. So that's an example of doing exactly this class of stuff in practice with our methods. Now, and aside from that, I myself cannot cite like the United Nations is doing it or anybody else. And if they were using my methods, I would probably know about it because they probably would have taken contact. So if anybody does know of either much better methods, mine or not, please take contact and maybe we can publicize it. If somebody says, Tom, I've been using your methods for Save the Children Fund for 20 years, great. Tell me about it and let me help you on the side. So the answer is, I don't think a lot's going on. But I have, my experience tells me that people are doing things, but they don't tell you until you ask. So in a sense, I'm appealing.
My question was more about, we as citizens of the world who have a stake in all of this, we should be demanding that they do that.
I hereby demand that the U.S. plan better.
Yeah.
And I will be the angry young man, and I will be publicizing the fact that they're doing bullshit work, and the people doing the planning need to be retrained. And I will be vocal, but I don't know one single person in the UN who I can convey this message. I have no personal contacts whatsoever. I'm hoping that this will lead to them taking contact with me.
Well, I think we should be starting a petition on something like Avaz, because they will gather signatures and support for an idea and then take it to the right people.
You mean like a specialist group at BCS?
Specialist groups don't generally act as pressure groups.
Okay. Well, yeah. Well, I'm glad to support and donate all knowledge to any group that wants to work on this. That's all I can do at my level.
Do you have other questions? Yeah. We have a question from Tanya Reynolds.
Hello, Tanya.
I don't think we can hear Tanya. Her question was, Dear Tom, have you contacted GRI? I'm not sure what GRI is.
Oh, yeah. So when I, probably not, since I don't even know what it means. Government Research Institute. Now, Tanya, let me give you a general answer. I'm just one retired person And in any country alone, there are probably 500 planning institutes for good causes. So I can't go out and contact. What I can do is I can put stuff on the internet. I can hold courses at BCS, and people can find their way to this material, and they can find their way to me too. So I do not go out and market these ideas to charitable organizations, but I'm very receptive to organizations that want help. And it's all in writing, it's all free, and I'd even very happily, Kai and I have donated our time, like I mentioned, Norwegian Christian Aid for 2 years, very happily donated our time because we feel good about making the world a better place. So ask the GRI to contact me, whoever they are, and we'll talk.
Tanya said she'd send you an email, so that's good.
Thanks. Good. Thanks for that, Tanya. I'll follow it up, promise.
There's a link here from Alec McCulloch. He's pointed us to globalreporting.org/page.
Okay.
Do you know that?
No, that is not by the, but I'm very happy to look it up and be informed.
Okay, thank you. And Olivia has a question. Olivia, do you want to put your question on?
Olivia.
Yeah, hi. It was more a comment on that. If people are interested in speaking with someone at the UN and they don't know who to go to, they can always contact the local embassy. Every country has an embassy.
The UN embassy.
And well, no, they have to go to their own foreign ministry. Usually you could find a way to do that.
Right.
Foreign ministry, and if you're in another country, I suppose if you were, I don't know, if you were in the UK, Tom, you could go to the Norwegian embassy in London. So
I'm in
all
Norway
countries,
right now.
yeah. So, but the foreign ministry, or depending on where one is, you could go to an embassy and speak with the political counselor or political desk or UN desk, and
okay. Now, by the way, see, I'm not going to go. I know how to. I know where the United Nations websites are. I can't go to all possible sources and say, "Hi, I'm here. Would you like to listen to me?" Not going to happen. If anybody else wants to do that, they're welcome to be my ambassadors.
Right. This is partly what I was saying to others. Anyone who wants to know who to contact in the UN.
Yeah.
One way is to go to their foreign ministry. You could and look on the government websites for that. Depending on where they are, they could go to an embassy. London is probably one of the few countries that has like an embassy for most all countries.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's that. And in the UK, there's also the United Nations Association, the UNA.
Right. Yes.
And there may be many, at least Western countries, and I think in the U.S. as well.
Okay.
They may also have the equivalent.
What we need to do is find channels into people who are effective in change. I wish that these United Nations plan had a little footnote saying, if you have any complaint about these plans, here's your email or website to complain. I'm practicing that. You see.
Yeah, you have to go to your foreign ministry.
Right
We'd have
now, says, if you don't like my ideas, here's where you complain.
Yeah. They don't come that so easily, right? So going to one's foreign ministry is an option.
A big bureaucratic monster you don't know who to talk to. But I'm sort of hoping somebody will feel a little bit insulted and take contact with me. The insults are intended. Okay.
Well, we've come to the end of the time, and I'm very, very grateful to Tom for preparing all these. It's a two-hour lecture, but it takes a lot longer than that to prepare. So thank you very much for all the input of time that you've given us.
My pleasure. And maybe one day we will hold these courses as courses live in London as previously planned.
That would be fantastic.
I'm ready when the world is ready.
Yes. And thank you also to Margaret for agreeing to have the Quality Specialist Group co-sponsor this series.
Thank you, Margaret.
I did offer
Thank
Tom
you.
one of the BCS books as a token of appreciation, and he declined. But I know your favourite tip, Tom, and I did buy a bottle ready for you to come over, and you will get it when you next. So
Good.
thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, you're
Thank you.
Kai. Kai has invited people to a Zoom launch party for tonight's SpaceX launch of the International Space Station. So I'll be joining that shortly.
Fantastic.
Yeah, they've already started. Have they launched yet? This is
Oh, no,
SpaceX.
they're sitting atop the rocket and waiting. It's another hour and a quarter, I think.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Oh, yes.
I think I'll end up joining that. Yeah, that's a good idea.
So
Let's
here's
hope.
reminded me that you're going to do another talk, aren't you, on the 23rd of June for the
Apparently, yeah, almost forgotten in the heat of getting these done. But yeah, so I'll be back, as Schwarzenegger says.
yes, indeed. That's under the auspices of the Business Change Specialist Group.
And you can keep tweeting about Joe, but you're just hurting other people. And of course, you're hurting yourself.
I'm not sure.
Sorry, am I hurting somebody?
I'm not sure who that was.
I think that was an accidental joining.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Okay. I hope I didn't hurt anybody's feelings too much.
Okay.
Very good.
Olivia, I will send you the link to that SpaceX launch on this chat in a moment.
Okay. Have you stopped the recording now, Imo?
Oh, we should stop the recording. You're right.
Thanks very much.